Hi, it's Dana, the ingredient inspector, home of Closest to Homemade. This is a look at the glycemic index and the glycemic load. What is the glycemic index? The glycemic index, or GI for short, it's a scale which reveals how carbohydrates raise blood sugar levels. It's based on pure glucose having a glycemic index of 100. Glucose is a monosaccharide simple sugar. So glucose is the basis for the glycemic index evaluation, and glucose has a GI of 100. The GI reflects the relative blood sugar response to consuming 50 grams of carbohydrate of a given food, eaten alone on an empty stomach, by measuring the increase in blood sugar after 90 to 120 minutes, or an hour and a half to 2 hours. The key point here is relative, that it's relative, all relative to glucose. That's what an index is showing things relative to something else, and in this case, the standard of glucose at 100. So for example, carbohydrates that yield blood sugar levels, which are 75% as high as those obtained after eating pure glucose, have a GI of 75. The lower the glycemic index, the healthier the carbohydrate is considered, because a lower GI means a lower blood sugar and lower insulin release, and a lower blood sugar and lower release of insulin is healthier. So 0 to 55 is low on the glycemic index, 56 to 69 is considered medium, and 70 and over is high. For perspective, peanuts have a glycemic index of 7. And a russet baked potato has a glycemic index of 111. So a potato has a greater effect on our blood sugar levels than pure glucose. It's over 100. It's very high at 111. Which factors influence variations in the glycemic index? There can be variations in the glycemic index, or GI. Who we are in terms of body chemistry can affect the glycemic index. We all process carbs differently. Each of us has a slightly different response to foods, which is unique to our body chemistry. For example, some of us have variations in our glycemic response depending on the time of day. The state of the food that we're eating. Is it raw, boiled, ground, for example? Raw fruits and veggies have a lower glycemic index versus cooked because the raw makes them slower to digest. The slower something is to digest, the lower the glycemic index because its effect, it's sort of slowly going into the bloodstream versus hitting it at once. Preparations like grinding the item or long cooking times make them faster to digest. So faster to digest equals higher glycemic index. The ripeness of something can affect the glycemic index. Certain items increase in carbohydrate content as they ripen, which simultaneously increases the GI. For example, a less mature green banana has a lower GI than a yellow banana because not as much starch has been converted to free sugar in a green banana. The longer a fruit or veggie is stored, the more starch has been converted to sugar, and this increases the glycemic index. The higher the GI is going to be, the longer the time that the fruit has had, or vegetable, has had the ability to convert some of its starch to free sugar. Other variations include the speed at which the carbs are eaten. The faster carbs are eaten, the quicker the insulin reaction, right? The faster something goes into our mouth and we consume it, the quicker it's going to enter the bloodstream. What else is eaten at the same time affects the glycemic index. So for example, pure glucose we know has a glycemic index of 100, but if glucose is consumed with 15 to 20 grams of fiber, the glycemic index is lowered into the 57 to 85 range, right? The introduction of fiber is slowing the process of the glucose entering the bloodstream. So it's reducing the glycemic index. It's reducing the effect of the carbohydrate on the insulin release. So glucose eaten with something high in fiber lowers the insulin release, which lowers the glycemic index by slowing digestion. Hopefully this is making sense. Glucose consumed with protein and fat moves the glycemic index of glucose down to 56. Once again, it lowers the effect of it. Which foods have a higher versus lower glycemic index? So this is sort of a quick directional thing to look at to help understand which tend to be higher and which tend to be lower. More processed foods have a higher GI, and less processed foods have a lower GI. Whole grains with a protective insoluble fiber seed coat have a lower GI than processed grains, which are digested more easily or quicker. So a whole grain, because it takes longer to digest because it has this insoluble fiber on the outside of it, has a lower glycemic index than processed grains, which don't have this protective coating, right? They've been processed into, say, white flour, and those are digested more easily, which has a quicker release of insulin. Raw veggies and fruits contain fiber, which slows down digestion. And the slower digestion leads to a slower release of insulin. So here's a look at things that are more quickly digested versus the version of kind of that same thing that's more slowly digested. So processed grains, as we spoke about, are more quickly digested than unprocessed grains. Cornflakes, for example, are more quickly digested than steel-cut oats. White rice is higher on the glycemic index than brown rice, although not significantly so, but it is higher. Cooked veggies are higher on the glycemic index versus raw veggies. And fruit juice is higher than raw fruit, right? You drink fruit juice and it goes directly into the bloodstream. Raw fruit, because of the fiber that it contains, slows that effect. White sugar is more quickly digested than, say, if you were to use fruit puree as a sweetener. So these ones that are more slowly digested contain more fiber, and fiber slows down digestion. We see these items up top containing fiber, and these on the bottom, of course, also contain fiber. But because the bottom two are fruit, there's a slightly different thing going on. And that's that the sugar, the primary sugar in fruit, is fructose. Fruits also contain other types of sugar, but the primary one is fructose. And the fructose in fruit is processed primarily in our livers, so it doesn't raise blood sugar the way other sugars do. Therefore, fruits, interestingly, tend not to be as high on the glycemic index as you may think. What is the problematic flaw of the glycemic index? This flaw was discovered as it was examined, sort of what was happening in terms of how items were being ranked on the glycemic index, and a significant flaw was discovered. The flaw of the glycemic index is that it can be misleading for certain foods. The glycemic index is based on consuming 50 grams of carbohydrates of a given food. But when we consider something like watermelon, this is where the flaw is revealed. So 50 grams of carbohydrates found in watermelon, that's what the glycemic index for watermelon is based on. Watermelon has a high glycemic index because 50 grams of carbohydrates isolated from watermelon contain a lot of natural sweetness, so it has a glycemic index of 72. But since a watermelon is 92% water, it actually contains a very small amount of carbohydrates. We would have to consume a lot of watermelon to reach 50 carbs, which is not what we do. This is not realistic in terms of its evaluation. So it was concluded that this is misleading in terms of how certain things end up being classified through the glycemic index. And as a result, the glycemic load was developed. If a food has a low GL, it likely has a low GI, but the reverse is not always consistent. So let's take a look at that. So what is the glycemic load? The glycemic load, or the GL, is a scale which reveals how carbohydrates raise blood sugar per serving of food. And serving is really the key here, whereas the glycemic index is isolating 50 grams of carbohydrate from a given food. The glycemic load is based on a serving of food. So it's a ranking system for carb content in food portions based on the glycemic index. The GL classifies foods based on the amount of carbohydrate in the food and the impact of that carb on blood sugar levels. So it's taking into account how much of the carbohydrate is being consumed in the calculation. The lower the glycemic load, the healthier the carbohydrate is considered. A GL of 10 or under is low, and a GL of 20 or over is high. So 0 to 10 is low, 11 to 19 is medium, and 20 or over is considered high on the glycemic load. The formula to calculate the glycemic load is taking the glycemic index, multiplying it by the net carbs, and dividing it by 100. Net carbs are total carbs minus the dietary fiber. So it's the item's glycemic index times the grams of available carbohydrate per serving divided by 100. For example, a 120 gram serving of watermelon has 6 grams of carbohydrates. And we know that watermelon has a glycemic index of 72. So 72 times 6 divided by 100 equals 4.3, which we round down to 4. So watermelon, from a glycemic index standpoint, has 72, which is considered high. But when we calculate the glycemic load per serving, a 120 gram serving, we see that the glycemic load is low at 4. So watermelon has a high GI and a low GL, and this is what had revealed sort of the weakness of the index, is it didn't take into account how much we were consuming in the calculation. The index, the glycemic index, never changes. The glycemic index for watermelon will always be 72, but the glycemic load accounts for how much of it has been consumed in the serving. And so obviously the higher the serving goes, the higher the glycemic load will go. So the glycemic load does change based on the serving size, and that is sort of how the two interact together. What is the GI and GL of some fruits? Now that we've talked about that, let's take a look at the realities of what some of these fruits are in this case. Ranked by glycemic index from low to high, these fruits that we're looking at come in this order. Grapefruit at the lowest, and then pear, red apple, orange, peach, grapes, banana, and there's that watermelon. So ranked by glycemic index, this is how the fruits fall in order from low to high. But when we look at them ranked by glycemic load from low to high, we see a slightly different order. We see that the grapefruit is still at the bottom, but the watermelon has moved its position significantly. And that's the interesting point and the difference that is illustrated by viewing these things through both the glycemic index and the glycemic load. So hopefully that was helpful. Hopefully you know a little bit more about the glycemic index and the glycemic load and how things affect blood sugar levels. So that's the ingredient inspector with closest to homemade, so you can make excellent decisions about what is best for you. The ingredient inspector on YouTube and at ingredientinspector.org. Share with the ones you love.